No checklist completed is going to save you. No bucket list is going to save you. No amount of blood, sweat, and tears that you've poured out in your life is going to save you. No amount of cash or worldly possessions is going to save you. You can't take it with you. You'll be dead. Buddha can't save you. Gandhi can't enlighten you. The Pope can't absolve your sins. The saints can't pray you into eternal life. Muhammad can't fix you. Allah isn't able. No president, no legislation, no Supreme Court justice, no state or nation or leader or celebrity. No one can save you because there is salvation in no one else.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Bearded Bible Thinker. Deuteronomy chapter 6, beginning in verse 4 says, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one. You shall love Yahweh your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. These words which I'm commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons and shall speak of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as phylacteries between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." Hey, welcome again to this episode of the Bearded Bible Thinker podcast. Today, I have a guest with me. Shane Bradley is his name. How's it going, Shane?
Good. Hey, Pastor.
So Shane is the administrator of Hope Christian Academy here in town. It's a Christian school, just what it sounds like. And we're going to talk today about education. So this month has been all about engaging with the culture as Christians and really our duty to do that. And what does that look like? How do we do that? And so we've talked about many things over the course of the month. And this is a big one, I think. Christian education is one of the places that the whole thing begins, right? So, but before we get into the whole meat of the matter, Shane, who is Shane Bradley? How did you come to get where you are?
Yeah, so Shane Bradley is right now, a good way to start is I'm happily married to Leah Bradley, and we have a daughter, Valedia Bradley, who's a senior graduating this year from Hope Christian Academy. And so that's where I'll start there. I was born in Dickinson when my parents were living in Kildare, and then I was reborn in Dickinson.
Okay,
so
yeah.
I had two beginnings. And they were both in Dickinson. And so other than that, if you get to know me, I love studying theology. Mm-hmm. Love definitely over the course of the past few years, I've been really loving and studying the Christian school movement and all the big players in that movement and getting of where it is today. But I'm also a sports fan. I played even at the college level baseball.
Okay. What's your team?
So that's the point. That's the point right now where I'm a little proud right now because at the NFL level, I grew up watching the Minnesota Vikings, and so that was always a big part. But my dad grew up in Michigan. Okay. In fact, we ended up living there for a little while when I was a kid, but so the Michigan Wolverines. I don't know. Do you know anything?
Michigan Wolverines. I haven't. I'm out of all sorts of loops.
Which is okay. But for you to know, they just won the national championship.
For football?
Yeah, for college football. Wow. So NFL, Vikings.
That's a big deal.
Haven't had any success there with winning a Super Bowl.
But, in fact, Michigan might be able to beat them, it sounds like.
Well, yeah, they had a good year, no question. But that was fun. So I say that just as a little, I really enjoy watching a good football game in sports, and so, in fact, I would say that's been a big part of when you talk about engaging culture and things like that. Mm-hmm. After being discipled in becoming Christian, being discipled in Dickinson through a good friend of mine and Pastor Ron Dizelle actually led me to Christ.
And, I didn't know that.
And so it really became a big part of my Christian witness and then being involved with different sports teams in different ways. And a lot of, as when you're committed to, when you give your life to Christ, you begin a new life and a new adventure.
Yeah, for sure.
And so that's taken me even around the world in South Africa, Zimbabwe.
Doing mission work?
Yeah,
Or- yeah.
actually going with an organization called Athletes in Action.
Oh.
With baseball and
Okay.
and then
Familiar, yeah.
yeah, and then Venezuela, playing a little bit in the Wooden Bat League in Dallas and in Florida, and then even had the great opportunity to just play with a bunch of great guys, and so
Yeah.
that's been a pretty big part of our lives.
So how did you go from all of that? Like, what led you to become an administrator at a Christian school?
Yeah, short story in the sense of, to not go into all the details, but I graduated from Northwest Missouri State.
Okay.
In Maryville, Missouri, and graduated with a degree in education. And so I taught Missouri, and then
So you're not just faking this?
No.
You all right.
Well, I would say that I've had to come home a little bit from the Christian education perspective.
Yeah.
However, that's what my degree was, and then of course taught in Missouri. Then we moved to Texas and taught there in Texas, and so I've been in education all my life. Well, from Texas, we went from Missouri to Texas, and then we moved to Mexico, and we established a English school and a football team.
Dude,
an American
I didn't know
football.
any of this stuff about you. You've been all over the place.
Yeah,
That's
I literally
crazy.
say I think I was pretty sheltered with my family growing up and being in a few places, but yeah, been to a lot of places around the world, and it's been super exciting because you get to see God move in different cultures around the world, and it's not just here; it's just all around the world what God's doing.
Yeah,
So-
and you get to see like firsthand that it's the same God. Like the same kinds of things happen. It might look a little different depending on the culture, but the same sinners becoming saints kind of thing. But yeah, that's pretty cool. So you're in Mexico.
And I would say, I know we share a little bit of this, but
Sure.
it gives you a little bit of an optimistic view.
Of what?
But in the sense of you're seeing how something
Yeah.
small that started in Jerusalem has spread throughout the whole world.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so yeah, he's
And
talking about postmillennialism, everyone.
But one of the things that to get to your final question about Dickinson is that we were doing some trying to bring that engaging culture in Mexico and living there for 5 years, and then just needed to come back for a number of reasons. And we have our daughter Valedia and wanted her to get plugged in here, but talked to at that time it was around 2010, so it was a booming time here.
Yep, for sure.
And so the Hope Christian Academy was growing a lot, and I talked to Pastor Ron, and he said, well, there is something here. And we just talked through things, and before you knew it, I was interviewing to be a part of the staff at Hope Christian Academy as a associate to Ron. And then
at that time, Ron was the administrator.
he was the administrator. Yep.
And so Ron Dizell, who he's talking about, Ron Dizell is the lead pastor now of Evangelical Bible Church across town. So Ron was the administrator, and you were just under him.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that was the beginning. And so then we moved, and we didn't know necessarily how long, but we needed to come back to the States. So, and then, so since we moved in at the end of 2010, we've been here ever since.
Wow. So you actually, at this point, you've got quite a bit of experience, even in, not only in general, throughout the world doing the education thing, but even here in Dickinson. You've been here a minute. I didn't realize that you'd been.
Yeah, I would say also learned Spanish, learned a lot of different cultures, and was exposed to a lot of different things. And yeah, I would say became very well schooled in the school of life.
Yeah, sure.
I wish it's not about going to filling my mind with a bunch of things. I think that there was a lot of things that God taught me over through the school of life and through walking with him and falling with him and just doing life as with King Jesus. And
Yeah. Well, that's pretty cool. I'm glad that we did this because I didn't know most of that stuff about your life and your journey there. That's pretty sweet. And it's kind of cool that God has brought you kind of full circle, right? Like right back to Dickinson where everything started. Yeah. It's almost like he has some sort of plan.
Yeah, you speak of plans that if both of us would share the amazing things that God has done in our lives through providence, you can't question his reality and his ongoing.
Yeah.
It's just amazing how all those things work.
There's no way. I mean, as I look back at different things in my own life too, so like I hear somebody said once that everyone is born again as an Arminian, because like at that point you don't know anything except I want to do this, and then like as I look back though now and study and look back at all of the ways, right, that God was actually so involved and leading and putting me in the family I was in, putting me geographically where I was, on down to the minute details of like specific friends in my life. And it's crazy.
Well, think about this. So my wife was born in Mexico City, over 30 million people.
Yeah. Okay.
That's a lot. Small town, North Dakota.
Uh-huh.
When we didn't know this, but when her family became Christians, they were discipled by a family in Texas. And that family grew up the wife grew up in Carlstead, North Dakota.
Oh my goodness.
And they actually discipled my wife's family.
Uh-huh.
Well, interestingly enough, that wife was my aunt's best friend.
Oh my gosh.
So it's like when you look at those types of things, it's like what you were saying in your own life. You have stories and stories like that where it's once you see the big picture, it's amazing to look back on.
Yeah, it definitely is. God is good. So shift gears just a little bit. Like, so you've been in this administration role for quite a while now. I mean, either just under Ron or now the administrator. You fired Ron, and
actually it was like, that's funny. But he was so needed.
Yeah.
Just during the boom at the church level, it was like it was not expected for me to transition this quickly into administrative, but the church and the school was growing, and there was a need. So
okay, what is just in like kind of the day to day, right? What is so we homeschool, right? We did public school for a while in the beginning. In a Christian, like in your role, what does a day look like? I mean, I'm sure it's different every day at some level, right?
Yeah, it's a good question. And as I was thinking about it, I take it to be like a picture of a shepherd. You know, when you're trying to guide kids, or I think there's a lot of biblical ideas of leaders or shepherds.
Yep, sure.
And so a shepherd, you know, number one is a good one would care for the sheep. So I would say on a daily basis, I mean, I know pretty much every kid's name. And
how many kids do you have at Hope?
Well, right now there's about 160. There's 167.
Yeah, that's a lot of kids.
So
that's pretty cool.
When I know them by name, now when it gets to
you're just like Jesus.
Well, when it gets to know, like when you're talking about daycare, preschool,
sure.
I don't have as much, but I know almost all of our kids by name. In fact, I know by doing after-school dismissal, I know all the kids, their vehicles, some of their grandparents, and so by walking kids to their cars every day and trying to be a little bit of have that as a supervision. So I would say if you're talking about what is a day in a life, well, if you take that analogy, there's some care and there's some personal getting to know, so there's that aspect. I would say another aspect is you're trying to protect.
Yep.
And that plays out in a lot of different levels on a day to day. But you're also making sure that they're eating right.
That's something you don't think about, I guess, from like this side of the table.
And I'm not talking about like what they're physically eating, although that's super important. If they're eating poison, that's going to be a detriment. So as a supporter of Christian parents, if there's something that's coming into that they're feeding on that's poisonous, that's going to affect their walk with the Lord, their understanding of His world and His instruction, if God's being left out of that. So I'm just saying it's important to be a guard and a watchman over instruction and the instructional things that are being taught to the kids. So I would say that there's a shepherding as far as like that instructional leadership and making sure that we're doing right by our parents by teaching a biblical worldview in that way. And then I think a big part of that is helping the sheep or helping the kids discern a little bit that way. And so just trying to constantly put before them the truth, the goodness, and the beauty.
Okay,
and then so you have that, and so then on the other hand, you have the false and the evil. And so there's a constant teaching of discernment and trying to really build that culture.
Like between the real and the counterfeit.
The real and the counterfeit, yeah. And so if you say on a daily, now how that plays out on a day-to-day basis, but hopefully it starts with that care.
Yeah.
With the type of shepherding care that you hope. That I would say that every mom and dad, that they can look me in the eye, and I'm trying to do my best to really take care of the kids from a spiritual aspect, from a safety aspect, in every way possible.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And because like at the end of the day, of course I can't speak for public school administrators that I do not know, right? However, just with our experience, on the one hand, there tend to be a lot more than 160 kids, right, at a typical public school, especially because you guys are like K through 12, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So I mean that
Pre-K through
ends
12.
up in our public school system, even here in Dickinson, that's a bigger number, right? So I want to be fair, but at the same time, even drop the Christian bit for a second, even from just a care standpoint, from a secular worldview, that's got to be hard or impossible for a public school principal, I guess is what it would be in that realm. But now, like, as we think, so we started homeschooling a few years ago, and we had reasons for that, right? And again, to be fair, I don't want to paint our public schools in a way that I didn't necessarily experience, but our boys were getting into grade levels and things like that, in which, I mean, they're beginning to learn about science, and that, like, some of which was not true, right? And they're going to begin to learn about different concepts and ethics and different things like that. And my conviction more and more became what I read out of Deuteronomy, right? That this is my job to ensure that they get not only like reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? But the worldview bit. And even the true things that they would learn from that system and are going to be learned from a worldview. And so for me, it got to a point where I was like I actually, since I'm responsible for this, like at the end of the day, since I'm going to be held accountable, I'm going to stand before God at the end of the day for the education that my sons received. Because of that, and because I have a job and stuff, like I don't have time to unteach the things that they would be learning, especially as they progressed into like further on in different grade levels and stuff. So for me, there was a practical aspect of it too, why we moved away from that and started doing it ourselves, because on the one hand, I began to see things that I hadn't seen before through like lenses, new lenses, if you will. And so I began to have a conviction about this personally and the weight of it. And then it was like, I mean, so my sons had been getting that worldview because they would come home and be like, yeah, well, they were talking about this millions of years thing. And they were frustrated when they were introduced to things like that, right? Because they knew better. But I mean, the things that happen, even in our little, Dickinson is a small town compared to lots of places in the world, in our nation. It's a big town compared to lots of places in North Dakota. But even in Dickinson, sometimes the things that get taught or the things that happen, right? Because they get taught by experience also. are from just the complete opposite worldview. And so for me, there's a reason that we moved away from that. And I think it's important too to give a shout out to the teachers that are engaged. Like we have teachers in our church that are public school teachers, and they're Christian public school teachers, and they do what they can and
shout out.
Work. Yeah. So, and that's a tough gig.
Principals, school administrators at all different levels. There's great people doing great jobs, and
yeah. So I don't for anyone watching or listening, this isn't by any stretch of the imagination. The goal here isn't to be like, oh, public school's terrible, to like burn it to the ground. No questions asked, right? Because there are legitimate Christian people who are working hard in that realm. And in fact, that would be much harder. I actually don't know that I could do it without just losing my job, to be honest with you. There's a reason, I guess, is where I'm headed with that. There's a reason that we moved toward that. There's a reason that the homeschool movement in Dickinson is exploding. And frankly, all around the nation, that's exploding. And Christian schools, you guys are growing, right?
There's 3 or 4 schools. I think there's a new school that I wasn't, but in Dickinson, and there's a reason, and I think everybody appreciates those options. Mm-hmm. When we're coming from a Christian perspective, and I'd say educationally great schools, doing well in number of things, but of course, when you're the parent, then you got to think about the type of worldview that's being presented. But yeah, it's definitely. That's where, as we kind of opened up and we were talking about of what I've really been reading and studying, it's been exciting to see a big movement, recent in the thing you're talking about.
Yeah, I think more and more people are, and honestly, it makes sense, right? Because as the morality of our nation, I don't even want to say gets worse, but shows itself more clearly, as that is happening more and more around us, I think God is showing mercy to a lot of Christian families, and eyes are kind of being opened more. And I, in the same way, so one of my pet peeves here in church life, right, is parents. So when I grew up, this was an issue. I know, not necessarily in my own family, but it was a thing, right? That all of the discipleship was the church's problem, right? Mm-hmm. Like you send your kids to Sunday school and Awana, those kinds of things, and youth group was one. And then at home, there really wasn't their family worship wasn't a thing. It was the church's responsibility. And I think while that is very incorrect biblically, like that responsibility falls on the head of the home first and foremost. And things like Sunday school and Awana, those are supplemental at best. They're not bad, but they're just extras, right? They should be reinforcing what dad and mom are doing at home. And I think the same way, really, the same thing applies to education. So what is the reason? Like we've talked about public school, and what's the reason? Why Christian education? Why instead of just education in general?
Well, I mean, I think you opened up, I've thought about that verse many times, but Deuteronomy. Yeah. We're on the same page. I mean, and it basically says, the things that I've commanded you today shall be on your heart. And then it says, you shall teach them diligently to your sons and speak at all. It should be done all the time. So we have a biblical mandate as parents to teach the instructions of God. That's a precedent that has been set. And even that, I mean, we were just kind of having a conversation before we were talking now, is that you're going through Ephesians, and Ephesians 6, 2 through 4, honor your father and mothers, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may turn out well for you, and that fathers don't provoke the children to anger. And then this is a command. And Paul's not inventing something new.
Right.
He's taking Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
And he's looking at the fathers, and he's saying, it says, to bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. So when you talk about spheres of authority, God gave the authority to the family to educate.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a real clear. And then another thing too is when you look at the fear of the Lord as the beginning of wisdom.
Yep.
I mean, if you start with actually just even the beginning of knowledge, the fear of the Lord. So, I mean, without that as even a start, just us being his creatures, are being in his world that he created and who we are. I mean, it starts first and foremost with that. So that's, I think it's I don't think that's really debatable. I mean, I think, and it's also, it's an absolute clear precedent in the Bible.
Yeah.
And it's how things are passed on.
Yeah, for sure. And I think when you look at like throughout the history of Israel, there are so many examples of what happens when that doesn't happen, right? Like throughout the Old Testament, one of the things that you repetitively see from this Deuteronomy 6. So Deuteronomy, if you don't know, Deuteronomy is essentially Moses going over the whole law again and the covenant and the whole thing before he dies. And so Deuteronomy, when he's doing that, so he lays that down. This is just the 6th chapter that I read at the beginning that you talked about. And what follows is the rest of the Old Testament, in which particularly the history books that would follow, in which you watch, right? Like, oh, this person was a good king, a godly king or whatever. And then, oh, this generation went back to the sins of so-and-so, right? I mean, you see that not happening. And when that doesn't happen, it never goes well, right?
Yeah, it never goes well. And I do think that when we were talking about you as a parent and how have come to different things, it's like, I do think, I'll just say this is just something that is becoming clear, and I don't know if I've probably believed a lie in the sense that I've at one time thought that education was neutral.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And I think that's becoming clearer and clearer now that it's not.
Yeah.
And so when are you going to really kind of expose to a kid to all the, in the sense of it's a gradual release of responsibility. So you're when you start teaching a kid to drive, it's pretty controlled. You're starting in a parking lot, and there's a lot that the shepherd is doing to make sure that things are controlled and things like this. And then, but eventually, so when you're talking about when and how that all plays out as far as their involvement in the world, in their independence, I mean, I think it's a gradual release of responsibility. And there's a time when that instruction needs to be really taken care of.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think, too, one of the things that is important in the scriptures as we think about why Christian education is, you mentioned Ephesians chapter 6. So it was kind of halfway a joke growing up. My parents would do this to bug me, tease me and stuff more than anything. But Ephesians 6:1 was, I had that memorized when I was really young. Children, obey your parents, for this is right. But I think as I hear that from all scriptures, God breathed, Paul said this, but God said this, right? And so as I think about this mandate to children to obey your parents, as a parent, one of the things that comes to my mind is I should be worthy of obeying, worthy of their obedience. And two, the things that I'm commanding, right, or teaching, should be worthy of their obedience. They should be good things, right? And what is the Great Commission? All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. So go, therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey all that I've commanded you.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much, because another thing, too, is like all these instructions are meant for human flourishing.
Right, yeah.
And I think that's being lost. It's like it's becoming the opposite. Man, you're obeying your parents, or you're honoring your... No, that's the way God designed for us to flourish as a society, and to take dominion and fill the earth and do the things that we're supposed to do as human beings.
Yeah, it's like right in the very beginning. That
Right
was
in the
the whole
beginning.
thing. Yeah, yeah. So, how do you? So, as we look back, right, throughout the history of the church, the history of church life. I mean, I would view the church as being an Old Testament thing as well, right? But So all the way back to Deuteronomy 6, right? And
We're on
even
the same
previous
page.
to that, right? So, but historically, what is we've talked about some biblical things, but just in church history, like what's the Christian education, right? Is there a precedent for that throughout church history as well that we point to?
Well, yeah, I take the same thing you as Israel entered into covenant, and then of course we're grafted into that commonwealth, and we are that. And so in history and in Christ, we're just so privileged to be a part of that history. But in Christ, as that gospel spread, of course, when you look at education today, there was a model that was set up by, I believe it was the Greeks, and it was a liberal arts education. And as the gospel spread, and that was kind of the model, the Christian church took that model and they began to implement it. And now that's evolved, and as the Reformation happened and all these things, but that was the model. And I would say, I'm not like but I would say that's Christian.
Yeah.
That's Western civilization.
Yeah.
So
right.
when you say history, I would say, has Christianity or the church had an impact on the world today, or in Western? I mean, that's how things were. The Christian education was the foundation, and I mean, you can even go back to the founding universities.
Yep.
Here and
Back before they were crazy.
great, amazing Christian, where they were just pressing King Jesus in every aspect of life and teaching a phenomenal liberal arts education. And that was, I believe, up till the 1915 when John Dewey and the progressive movement of education, and then even kind of going to where the modern movement is. But I would say less Christian and more trying to be neutral.
Inclusive.
Yeah.
Of everybody.
And even the methodology of just a lot of different fads and things that go on. It's not, the basis isn't the original, even the Greece was ideas like they're trying to form virtuous citizens in a free society.
Right.
But you can't have freedom without virtue. And that, maybe people disagree with that, but there has to be virtue.
Well, yeah,
with that. And so the part of the beginning of that type of education was wisdom and virtue. And so how do you even define that without the Bible?
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's to that point, that's always the big thing when you see like a solid Christian person in a debate of some sort with an atheist or something like that. That's one of the main arguments that comes up, the morality thing. And it's like, there isn't a basis in the maybe the overarching worldview that exists today outside of Christianity. Probably the most popular would be like secular humanism or secularism at some level, right? Like that worldview, that Darwinian evolution sort of thing. And there is no basis for morality in that. And there's not a good answer that they've ever given that question.
And that's, I think this Bible verse has been taken out of context, but is without a vision, the people live unrestrained. Mm-hmm. But here's the connection. It's not about a vision that's going to help you be a CEO of a company to guide. But happy are those who keep the law. Mm. So the vision that he's promoting is a biblical law vision for the vision that we need to live by, to flourish in restraint with virtuous liberty is a Bible vision.
Yeah.
It's a law vision that, and we don't have to guess as far as what that is. It's very clear throughout the Bible of what, and it just summed up in love God, love neighbor.
Yeah. Yeah, so in Sunday school right now, in adult Sunday school, we're walking through Exodus, and we just finished chapter 19 last week. So we're getting into the 10 Commandments, which is the next level, right, of detail under love God and love neighbor. And it's always, there are a lot of people, I think, that are unaware or just haven't studied, or who maybe get their information not from biblical study but from YouTube or something like that, like a lot of folks. And the moral law of God. So I think that that the 10 Commandments, before they were written on tablets of stone, like those are all things that were written on the heart of Adam even, right? We have one command that he was given, for sure, not to eat of the tree. But to obey that, he had to love God only. He had to love his wife. He, like, all of these other things were just kind of an assumption. They were written on his heart. That's how you lived in the garden, right? And it's not as if Abraham wouldn't have known these things about God, but they're written. Like, the 10 Commandments are nothing more than God's character on paper, right? Like, this is how we're to live. And so this would get us way off track, but the idea of the moral law of God still being in complete application today, like, that's a eternal thing. I mean, in fact, in so much as it would apply to the angelic world, they have to obey that, right? You see, what is the fallen angels? What did they do? Well, they didn't love the Lord their God first. I mean, at the end of the day, they broke the 10 Commandments, and that's why they're fallen. So this is something that is transcendent, the moral law of God.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's binding.
Yeah.
It's not something that, I mean, God's character, it doesn't change.
Right.
And he's not surprised by technology and all the stuff that's going on. This is the way that it was going to end up. He knew all, but his character and his laws apply to social media as much as any other.
Yeah.
How we live, how we love our neighbor. They're the end, the general equity of the whole, even life in Israel. You can apply all those principles. I mean, we're not necessarily having fences around our roofs because we're not hanging out there on our roofs very much.
Yeah, right.
But the idea is to protect your neighbor, to protect the person that you're having up there falling off. And that love God, love neighbor comes out in all those commandments, and even justice, punishment.
Yep. Yeah, I think I've even said this on other episodes, but if not, people can get mad when I say it now. But to that point, you have, so currently as we're recording this, it's January. When it airs, it'll be in February. So I've been doing also lots of work because January is Sanctity of Life Month. And so there's a lot of this abortion war and things like that. And the penalty for taking a human life is death. And that happens before the Mosaic law shows up, right? That was a Noah thing even. And God mandated that because they're image bearers. And I am always so frustrated so my wife likes watching like Dateline and those kinds of things, right? So we end up watching those true crime story things. And it's so frustrating. Like, even last night, she was watching something, and it was this dude who had killed 7 people. It was serial killer. And he'd taken the lives of 7 people. And he did some kind of plea bargain to take the death penalty off the table. And I'm like, that shouldn't happen. Like, as tactfully and with as much of a Christian heart as I can possibly have, they should have taken him out back and shot him and been done with it. Like, that's just where I'm at with the capital punishment thing, right? That when you take a life, you're giving yours up. That's the scriptural view.
Those are moral principles that are just not. It's furry, and I believe, and it's hard sometimes. Those are really tough, but it's meant for us to flourish as a human society. I mean, because God loves us, He created us, and His law, if we follow it, it's best.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, Christian education, right? I mean, we've been talking about a lot of stuff that I think is part of the foundation, part of the reason, part of the backbone of why it's necessary. So, like, in our particular cultural moment, how important in your mind is Christian education specifically?
So, I mean, of course, I think we've already tried this. I mean, it could be debatable about the settings and things, but no matter where you're sending your kid, that doesn't negate the responsibility for Christian education. Yeah. I mean, and I think every Christian would support that view. Yeah. Is they are the primary. And I know we get a little bit confused. You even talk about your own life, how it's kind of sometimes it's handed over to the church or this.
Yep.
And we kind of operate that way too. We for sure operate that the parents are the primary, and we're supporting that. And so, but when you talk about the cultural moment, I mean, I don't need to spend a lot of time in this, but it's very simple. That's how you pass on Christian society.
Yeah.
It has to be passed on somehow.
Yep.
And if you don't, and you let somebody else do it, that's how the society is going to turn up. And so in a very small, simple statement, how important it is to culture, well, if we want Christ's kingdom to grow and advance, we can't not engage in education.
Yeah, I think it starts. I mean, it obviously starts with the individual humans. I mean, so parents in this conversation, and their own study, their own fervor, their own love for God and neighbor. But growing out of that, the very first thing, if you're a parent, the very first thing is that you grow out of your own personal walk with Christ and submission to him is making disciples, the Great Commission. And the very first way that happens is with your youngsters, with your children. So, I mean, that if we did nothing else, which would be wrong, but if we did nothing else, if we did no other evangelism, no other mission work, whatever else, but we really, this is just obviously my view, I guess, but if we did nothing else, Great Commission like, other than raise our children in the nurture and instruction of the Lord, and did it well, and did it with intention, and did it with gusto, that would change the world. I really do believe that. Now, we obviously I do all the other things, and that's good also. We just had someone this past Sunday that came up after, and like I'm pretty sure that heart of stone had become a heart of flesh, right? Like miraculous things.
When you talk about culture too, and there is a type of mentality that creeps into Christian mindset. It's a Gnostic view. That Gnostic view is we're trying to escape this world somehow, and we just want to, it's all going down and this and that and whatever. And so why bother? That's not a biblical worldview.
Right.
If we love God and love neighbor, we're going to want the world to flourish under his authority and so it should affect every way and what we're passing on to the next generation. And I would say that there's a lot of great non-Christian people that have done a lot for in every aspect of life. And I do believe that Christian worldview should affect every area of life, his lordship, and if we do follow those principles. And so education is absolute. We want government, we want churches, we want every business to really to have that type of biblical instruction that would really to have an impact on in a good way.
Yeah,
the way that God designed. When he said, have dominion, follow, I mean, he was really putting a stamp of approval on engineering and building bridges and everything that however we would fill the earth and establish societies and all that. Everything's important. Pastors are important, welders are important, doctors, it's all important.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I would say, when I say Gnostic, it's kind of that idea of separating like spiritual versus,
Yeah.
It's all important. It's all.
Yeah, I think as men, we have a tendency, especially as men, we have a tendency to play the separation game, right?
Yep.
Like my church life, my home life, my football life, my whatever, right? Like whatever you want to put in there, right? But your church life, your Christ life, that has to be the umbrella. Like that has to be the sphere in which everything else in life functions. So, okay, just some practical things. Let's move into that. Some of the practicalities maybe of, so as we talk about Christian education, particularly, I guess there really isn't a difference, but just in particular from your perspective of like Hope Christian Academy or the Christian school, what makes it a Christian school specifically? Like are there criteria? Are there bullet points? Like what philosophy, whatever, what separates a Christian school from a public school or whatever?
And I would definitely say, I would love to sit here and tell you that, it's a perfect utopia.
Yeah. But then you'd be a socialist.
But I say, when you talk about a Christian school, you're not talking about a school without sin.
Yeah, right.
Families, society, life in general. I mean, the Christian, as long as we're here, we're fighting the fall.
Yeah.
And that's a biblical worldview that is being taught. So I say one separate thing that I would say is we're teaching the fall. The problems that have arisen is because of sin, not because the creation isn't good.
Yeah.
And God's world that he created isn't good, but the fall is. And so a Christian school is on a daily basis fighting the fall, just like everybody. But we're doing it from Christ as the answer, to restore and redeem, and to teach that God is making all things anew in Christ. And that's the answer. Mm-hmm. And when we do fail and things get really messy, there's restoration, there's mercy, there's forgiveness in Christ. So that would be a worldview idea. Another thing too is, in the sense that what you're separating is that when you talk about Christian worldview, I say it's not complicated. It's three things. In the beginning, God created. So creation, fall, and then redemption. So that's a biblical worldview. So when you look at the lens of the world today, we see creation, we see the effects of the fall, but we see a plan to restore that in Christ.
Yeah.
And so that's a big, and I would say a Christian school, if it's a Christian school in name, that means it's a Christ school. So what you've made a decision is not to be a perfect school, but you're now under the authority and reign of Jesus Christ. So Christ is Lord.
Yeah.
And so, as Christ is Lord, he has some instructions for us. So that the only place that we have that is Bible. So what would separate, I would say, even so-called maybe Christian schools, is the Bible has to be the ultimate authority.
Yeah.
And so when you're talking about a king, you have a king, but you have instructions of the king. Well, that instruction's given to us. It was handed. He set up apostles to guide the lifelong ministries of everything we do. So we can behave badly and go, but the mission and the vision of that can't change. Christ is king. The Father gave him all authority in heaven and on earth. That includes Hope Christian Academy. And so we have to go to him as Lord and follow his instructions in every way. So I would say that's what would be, in a sense, some distinctives.
Yeah, it's interesting when you were talking about that for me, it seems like one of the things that you were kind of saying was really good was even what you began with, right? That there is almost as if it's not that Christian schools are without sin. It's just that Christian schools probably acknowledge sin. Right, more.
Yeah, because sin is transgression against his law.
Right.
That's and so there's a definition for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And in maybe a public school setting where it's more about inclusion these days than ever before, or maybe I haven't thought through that, but maybe a more true statement would be there's more diverse thinking and worldview to include than ever before. But the problem in that worldview could be several things, and there are several of them, but sin isn't the basis, right? At the end of the day, I mean, that's what makes us Christian in general, right? Is those three things that you mentioned, right? Like that particular worldview.
Yeah, as I was we went to a Christian school, visited over this past year, and we were talking to a school administrator, and what are some challenges that you're facing with
you guys asked him that?
Yeah, we asked him that. He didn't hesitate. He said, the biggest problem that we face is sin and the fall.
Yes.
And he said, the biggest problem I face in my own life is sin. The biggest face that and he was just like, this is the first thing he said.
Yeah.
And so you're exact. I'd be an absolute idiot if I didn't say I don't feel the effects of sin in my own life on a daily day. And so that's a challenge as people. And so we want to obey Christ in everything we do, but we're humble in the sense that, boy, that's a process, and God is helping us to become more and more victorious and things like that. But yeah, I mean, and unfortunately, if you look at our history, we can't sell Israel's perfect behavior.
Right.
We can't sell the best king, or probably in historic, we look at David, and we look at even our own church history after Christ. We can't point to perfection in any way.
Right. Yeah, and that American Gospel documentary, have you ever seen that before? There's one statement in there that is made that made me think of that, and it was that have you ever noticed that the Bible takes great care to, how did he say it? Something like, have you ever noticed that the Bible takes great care to tarnish the reputation of everybody except for one person?
Jesus, yeah,
right.
That's right.
Like, no matter who you point to, that we would probably think, oh, that dude wears a cape for sure, right? Like, no matter who you point to in the scriptures, that there's only one. In the whole book, there's only one.
The second Adam.
Yeah. Yeah, he didn't eat the fruit, baby. And he was the owner of the fruit. Certainly could have. So how do you keep it that way? Right? Like, that's a follow-up, right? Like, because I think in an age right now, we're in a moment culturally. You talked about essentially the Ivy Leagues, right? Like back in the beginning of the Harvards and Princetons and all of those things, they were very much Christian. I think actually Jonathan Edwards, his famous Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, was first preached not to his congregation, but at Princeton. I think it was one of those Ivy League schools. I mean, it was very much Christian in worldview and in goal, and the whole point of the colleges. And even in our own public school system, I mean, at first there's prayer, there's Bible reading, there's, even before America, right? Like, one of the reasons that in church history that they wanted to gather children and teach them to read was so that they could read the scriptures. Yeah. And now we're in this moment where, I mean, Harvard is pagan, Princeton, pagan, Penn State, pagan. I mean, name the state school, pagan, right? And even schools like Grand Canyon University, that is a Christian college, and several others, right? That there's so many things that are very pagan that are creeping in. It's even hard to find a seminary to train pastors in now.
Yeah, you're talking, broad. You mentioned public school, Christian schools, cities where you're not singling out. How do you maintain that? As I was thinking about that question, you have to, I would say, I know why I came here, because I knew a person. Mm-hmm. I knew Pastor Ron. Yep. So I knew it was a Christian school.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
And I hate to say this, but as you have newcomers come and they're looking for churches, I know you. And you can probably point to your elders. And so I think there's some leadership that, and if we do look at the kind of the history, and no success is no team is an island of one person.
Right.
And so you have your mission and vision, that you have a church, and it's all statement of faith, those things that you can point to that just have to be there. But how does it maintain? Well, it's got to fall in the hands of good leadership and to be maintained. But ultimately, I think we enter into the sovereignty of God.
Yeah.
And how, when it doesn't go that way, he takes away and he brings people that are faithful.
Yeah.
That can, because his kingdom is going to advance with or without Hope Christian Academy.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point too, right?
Or United States society.
Right.
I mean, his kingdom is bigger than us. And
everything is expendable.
And societies have fallen, and God used a more righteous nation to rise up, and a better whatever.
Yeah, we've had similar conversations because just at the church level, right? Obviously, again, different than a Christian school in many ways, but in some ways similar, right? And particularly what you just talked about, we've historically had elders, deacons, that kind of thing, that there's tension, there's arguing, there's not one like unity, a unified direction. We've had situations where like pastors thought they were the man, and so everybody else who's in leadership is underneath them. They're the boss. Like we've had lots of unhealthy things. Let's just say it that way. But right now, by the grace of God alone, we have a really healthy leadership team at our church. We have elders who really, truly do care about the glory of God first. And one of our elders, every Monday, we meet weekly, every Monday morning as elders. And one of our elders almost every week prays, Lord, get us out of the way of your church, of what you want to do at your church. Don't let us hinder it, that kind of thing, right? And that's, I think, the summation of the heart of our team of elders. And so we've had some of the same, like, okay, well, how do you maintain that? Right? Because someone might fit into the 1 Timothy qualifications, for instance, and not necessarily fit the elders here, right? Like, and so it certainly includes 1 Timothy, but it's bigger than that too, in the sense that like you could match all of the things in 1 Timothy, and yet we might not get along because you're very different theologically, or so that, I mean, that's going to lead to butting heads and whatever else. So anyway, all that to say, the idea you presented about leadership team is, for us, like, this is something that we're going to ferociously guard. And it's not like, I have a buddy that I do podcasts with, Michael. He told me the story once of, he went to fill in at a church to preach one Sunday, and they had a sign-up sheet in the back for elder, because they didn't have enough elders, and so there was just a sign-up sheet, like a church potluck kind of thing, right? Like, just go and sign up to be an elder. Like, that's not the way to do it, right? Like, that's how you don't do it, because it's something to be guarded.
Yeah, in a nutshell, I mean, I think we're on the complete, because we could say, boy, we got this great statement of faith and mission and vision, but who's going to carry out that? And I think that's where we've been fortunate in a church and in the school, that the board and the leadership, it's a very strong leadership, and it's like what you're saying in your situation. People are just guarding. And I do look a little bit like that, as far as like when you talk about preservation of Christian instruction, is that if you do look at even Nehemiah when he was rebuilding, and maybe we're in that process where it's like, if you're not building, if you're just taking a Titanic view of it's a sinking ship, but I think we're supposed to be building, rebuilding, and they had a sword and a shovel, and the shovel was the building, and the sword was the fight that you're not gonna get away from, and so you just gotta fight, guard, and build.
Yeah, when I went to Afghanistan in 2009, our battalion was tasked with creating a fire base. This was an artillery battalion. So we went to, short version, we went to basically some field, right? It was desert. So we went to some just location where nothing existed. And then we slept in holes for a minute. But when the bulldozers and all that got there, started pushing berms up and all of that kind of thing. But the bulldozers aren't doing their stuff. You're not setting up tents. You're not doing any of that stuff without somebody with some pretty sweet weaponry hanging out right there, watching and on guard. And it is the same. It's the same thing. We have to, and we've talked about both of those things throughout the conversation, that it's a twofold thing, in that like a shepherd in general, you opened with that, the idea that as an administrator, one of the things that you kind of see yourself as a shepherd in a way, and the shepherd feeds the sheep, and the shepherd kills the wolves, right? Like, it's a both end. And
one other thing I do appreciate is you and other pastors from the community just coming together for us, for the entire community, and praying for us. And of course, that's an essential part of it. is when you have godly people praying. That I think that's a big part of some of the, like what you're saying, how you're preserving the healthiness of the Christian churches and schools and families and in our cities and things like that. So
yeah, it's been one of the great honors to show up on Wednesdays, and it's actually selfishly, it feeds me a lot to show up there with those other guys and just not have an agenda other than show up, hang out, laugh, pray for Dickinson and surrounding areas and our nation. We do that too. But so just kind of, I think as we continue to kind of move closer and closer, you've got to head out here before too long. One of the questions was, are there clear benefits to a school like Hope Christian Academy, for instance, over other options? And I think, honestly, I don't even think we need to go there, because everything we've talked about is that list, really, the Christian worldview being the big one. And so I think one of the things that when people hear, at least this is, I don't want to do the straw man thing, right? So when I hear, based on my past and experience with Christian school kids and when I was growing up and that kind of thing, and even as a parent, one of the things that you might think of is, oh, that's unaffordable, right? That's impossible to do that. People have that, homeschool has that stigma too, that this is just impossible. This is unaffordable. Public school's pretty much free, taxes do that anyway. So just at that level, right? What are some of the maybe challenges, ideas, false assumptions that need to be overcome or that can be overcome when a family thinks about maybe swapping or finds themselves convicted by some of the very same things we've talked about and is considering a Hope Christian Academy? What does that look like? How difficult is that?
Well, yeah. Switch? Yeah. And I would just kind of finish when you're talking about kind of benefits and things like that, is that we both firmly believe that each of those decisions, whatever it is, it's a parent decision.
Yep.
And so those are great options. And I would just say, just reemphasize, it's over 12,000 hours. So when you're considering it, if you are sending them outside the home to any school, it's 12,000 hours, over 12,000 hours that you're handing your kids over for instruction. And so one of the things just to kind of is just say one of our biggest benefits are, I would say, to a Christian family would be we seek to teach all subjects as an integrated whole with the Bible at the center. When you're dealing with an information age where it's just and part of the mission we have is to teach the true, good, and the beautiful, according to Paul, whatever is true, whatever is right, whatever is noble, think on these things, and help them to discern all the information that's coming out, the true, the good, and then if they view it as true, good, and beautiful, well, they're going to be inspired to do that. And I would also say that one thing that if you're going to be sending one of the things that we try to do is not teach an overemphasis on the trends that are happening, but a broad education where you're not emphasizing a certain aspect because, our day, and it's just we try to do what we're trying to do and even move towards is kind of a well-rounded liberal arts type of education that help form Western civilization, kind of get back to home in that regard, and that to put wisdom and virtue as the priority, so that at the end of the day, you have that as a goal to have wise and virtuous citizens that would help the civilization flourish. So the challenge, and I'll just end with that, the board doesn't want any family for finances to be the reason. And so that's why we have a strong tuition assistance. As long as I've ever been here, and we have very generous donors that are giving for that specific person that everybody can attend, Hope. And so I would say that if that's something it's a held back, and then that's just something that we've talked a lot, and we have a plan for tuition assistance and try to help families in every way possible.
Well, that's huge, because I know that finances, I mean, like maybe for some folks that sounds pretty petty and arbitrary, but I mean, if you're the family that in this world that we live in now has to, like, doesn't have a choice at the moment, but for mom and dad to both be at it, working outside the home, which happens, and perhaps you can't afford, or maybe you have a child that learns, like you couldn't pull off the homeschool thing for some reason. That financial stuff is a big hurdle for a lot of people.
And I also do want to paint a picture, because have you ever heard this song? Every day with Jesus is sweeter than the day before.
Okay, yeah, I've heard that. Yep.
That's not reality. And I wish I could say that, like, when you're talking about somebody who wants to, or I don't want you to come into the wrong impression, like, every day at Hope is sweeter than the day before. It's like, no, we do life together.
Yeah.
And we're fighting the fall.
Yes.
That's just an absolute reality. Selfishly, I would say that we have wonderful, caring people that help with that, but it's not, if you're thinking about it, and if your idea is every day at Hope is sweeter than the day before, you could talk to a few of our students, depending day in and day out, and even homeschoolers or public. I just don't think that's a reality of what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I don't think there's any form of it that isn't messy.
No, and I would say there's joy and there's trials, and absolutely, and it's a great place to be. But I'm not gonna.
Yeah, right.
I'm not gonna sing that song. Every day at Hope is sweeter.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, and I think just like you were very forthcoming at the very beginning of it, like one of the very things that sets any school or homeschool family or whatever apart as Christian in particular is not that there isn't sin, that the battle doesn't exist there. It's simply that we acknowledge first and foremost that is the battle. And so
that's a biblical worldview. It's there's a fall.
Yeah,
and
absolutely,
we're fighting
right.
And so
I think this may be a good place to come to kind of land the plane is just that, like everything that we've talked about, the whole point, right? The reason that I wanted to have you here to talk about Christian education is because the focus is engaging the culture for this month that this will be airing. And I personally, I think one of the ways that we engage the culture is, so just to get in trouble here at the end, you play the long game. You play the long game by the same way that the communists and other groups throughout history have done. Yes, we have to do these things and engage in culture, like you and me being out in the culture, doing whatever we can do, but we train our children to train their children, up in the nurture and instruction of the Lord. And so one of the ways that, and I know you agree with this, that one of the ways that we engage our culture successfully as Christians is by building it. And that's what Christian education does, I think.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think when you talk about that third part of the biblical worldview, redemption, it's making all things new. There's going to be a renewed heaven and earth. And it says there's life on earth. I know that goes into things, but your kids, I mean, at some point you're not going to be here.
Yep.
What are we leaving for the next? And I do think there's a lot of things that are free, but there is a cost to everything. And if we look at what we're doing as a whole, there's some of the life that we're living in today is the effects of the price that we're paying for.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yep. And so I do think that there is a cost to what we're doing right now to invest in the kingdom of God, and we're as parents taking that ownership and really considering and help in that.
Yeah. So Just to leave everybody with something tangible here, like some of the people that do listen to or watch this fairly regularly are people like from my church and some people just from Dickinson. So what, if people are from here, how do they get in touch? How do they learn more about hope in particular?
Yeah, a physical location. If you're like I like talking to people face to face.
Yeah.
I hate to say it. I mean, I could send an email, and you can do that too. But
that's not very 2024 of you.
Even with my teachers, I could just. I like to talk to them a lot. And I go and I'm in. So if you just come in to 2891 5th Street West.
2891 5th Street West.
That's our physical location to come anytime and to visit and to see. And our number to call if you want to come and visit is 701-225-3919. And then just some informational things that you could, if you wanted to search for us and look at a lot of different things, hcadickinson.org is our website.
Okay.
And we also have, you can search us on Facebook for that too. But those are a few ways.
Sweet. Well,
hey, before we leave, thanks, man. Thanks, brother. Appreciate it, because this was really fun talking with you. And I really appreciate your emphasis this February. It's a great emphasis. And it starts kind of with just having a lot of good conversations. And I appreciate that you're doing that. I appreciate it. And even just even having a voice to just even talk about Hope Christian Academy. And appreciate all the kids from Hillside that are there.
Yeah.
So
we have a bit of a representation there. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, thank you for coming on. And I know, so you don't do this kind of thing all the time. And so I know it's a new world to sit behind a microphone and talk for a while.
This is the first, actually.
Yeah. So there you go. Now you're a pro though, right? Like it's really not that difficult. So
thanks for the flattery.
Yeah. Well, I was hoping it would get me somewhere, but hey, thanks for joining us and sticking it out and listening or watching. And until next time, go train your children in the way that they should go.